She was sitting on the stone steps of the Hargrove County Courthouse at 8:17 in the morning, and the first thing anyone noticed was that she wasn't crying. The cold January air pressed down on everything, on the bare oak trees lining the entry path, on the breath of the small crowd that had gathered without quite meaning to, on the gray water that was still spreading slowly across the pale stone where a cleaning basin had tipped and spilled, soaking through the hem of a camel-colored coat, climbing the fabric in dark, uneven patches the way water always finds the lowest place and claims it. The woman sitting in the middle of all that was not young, and she was not helpless, and she was not confused about what had just happened to her. And somehow that was the thing that made the scene so difficult to look away from, because she was pressing one hand flat against the wet stone to push herself upright, and the other hand was already reaching for a leather briefcase that had landed 3 feet away when she fell, and her first instinct before speaking before doing anything else at all, was to make sure the briefcase was all right. The brass corner of it was freshly scratched, catching the pale winter light in a way that looked like a wound. She got to her feet without help, without hurry, without the performance of shock that the people watching seemed to expect from her, and she stood in her soaked coat on those cold courthouse steps with a stillness that was not weakness and was not surrender. It was something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. The stillness of a person who has already decided what comes next and is simply waiting for the right moment to begin. The man who had put her there was standing 4 steps above her with his chest out and his thumbs hooked into his belt, and his name was Officer Brandon Mercer, badge number 3, 847, 12 years in courthouse security, and he was looking down at her with the expression of a man who had just restored order to something that had briefly threatened to get away from him. He did not know, could not have known, would not have believed it if someone had told him that the woman standing below him in the dirty water, holding her scratched briefcase in one hand and a folded packet of courthouse tissues someone had pressed into the other, was the judge whose name was already printed on the emergency docket, being laid out inside the very building he thought he was protecting. He did not know that, before this morning was over, he would not be standing in front of any door in that building ever again. And he did not know that every choice he had made in the last 4 minutes, the grab, the drag, the shove, the words he had let fall like they cost him nothing, had already been witnessed by more people than he had noticed, and that none of them were going to forget what they had seen. She looked up at him once, steady and clear, and then she looked at the scratch on the briefcase corner again, and something in her face settled into a decision that was going to cost him everything. The thing about Brandon Mercer that his supervisor Walt Draper had always privately found useful and publicly pretended not to notice was that Brandon did not simply enforce the rules of the Hargrove County Courthouse. He believed in them, the way other men believed in religion, with the particular fervor of someone who has discovered that doctrine is most useful when you are the one interpreting it. He was 44 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way that had more to do with former high school football than any recent gym membership, with a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete, and a haircut that hadn't changed in a decade, close on the sides, flat on top. The kind of cut that said, "I stopped thinking about this a long time ago, and have no intention of starting again." His uniform was always pressed, which people sometimes mistook for professionalism, and which was actually closer to armor, because a pressed uniform was the first thing you noticed about a man, and it gave you something respectable to look at while you missed everything else about him. He had a habit when he was making a point of extending his right index finger and using it the way other people used a gavel, pointing it at a face, at a chest, at a door, at the direction he wanted someone to go, and the people who worked alongside him at the courthouse had stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing a smell after long enough, but newcomers always clocked it immediately because there was something about the gesture that felt less like instruction and more like threat. And the difference between those two things mattered enormously when you were deciding whether a man should be standing at the entry point of a building where frightened people came every day to ask for justice. His shoes were the other thing people remembered, heavy-soled, metal-tipped, the kind that rang against the marble entry floor with every step in a way that carried its own announcement, a sound that said, "I am here, and I have authority over this space, and you should adjust yourself accordingly." He had been at Hargrove County Courthouse for 12 years, which was long enough to know where every camera had a blind spot and which judges went through which entrances, and when long enough to have cultivated the particular confidence of someone who has never been seriously held accountable for anything, which is a different and more dangerous kind of confidence than the kind that comes from actually being good at what you do. The philosophy he operated by, and it was a philosophy fully formed with its own internal logic. However rotten the foundation was, one he had developed slowly over years of standing at thresholds and deciding who passed and who didn't. And it went something like this. The real power in a courthouse was not on the bench, and it was not in the law library, and it was not behind the prosecutor's table. It was at the door. It was in the first 15 seconds of contact. It was in the moment when a person arrived and had to prove to someone else that they had a right to be there. And the person doing the proving was the one who held everything briefly, completely in their hands. He had refined this belief around a specific incident 7 years ago that he carried like a badge of personal honor. A man in an expensive gray suit who had walked through the main entrance without being challenged, because Brandon had been momentarily distracted by a disturbance near the metal detectors, and who had turned out to be a defendant with an active warrant who had managed to spend 40 minutes inside the building before anyone caught him, and the reprimand Brandon received from Walt Draper afterward had been mild in the way institutional reprimands always were, but it had sunk into him like a splinter that never quite came out. And the lesson he drew from it was not that he needed better procedures, but that he needed sharper instincts about who looked wrong and what he meant by wrong. Though he would not have put it so plainly, was who did not match his idea of what a person with legitimate courthouse business was supposed to look like. The prior complaints against him, 2 written officially classified as resolved by Walt Draper's office, and several more that had been verbal and had evaporated before they could become paperwork, all followed a recognizable pattern that anyone willing to look at them together would have found deeply troubling. But Walt Draper had made a career out of looking at each one in isolation, classifying them individually as personality clashes or misunderstandings or isolated lapses in communication. Because Walt Draper understood instinctively that patterns were what got institutions in trouble and isolated incidents were what could be managed, and managing things was the skill he had spent 30 years perfecting. Brandon had arrived that morning at 7:55 earlier than his shift required, because the overnight crew had left a mess near the east checkpoint that annoyed him, and because standing outside in the cold gave him a feeling of ownership over the space that he couldn't quite get sitting in the security break room drinking the bad coffee that the courthouse provided. The morning was overcast, the kind of January gray that pressed down on everything without quite breaking into rain, and Brandon stood at the top of the main courthouse steps with his iced coffee from the gas station on Meridian Street. He always brought his own never trusted the courthouse stuff, and watched the sidewalk below with the particular alertness of a man who was looking for something to correct. He was in that state when Serena Miles came up the front walk. The call came at 4:17 in the morning, and Judge Serena Miles had the phone in her hand before the second ring finished, which was not because she slept lightly, but because she had been a judge long enough to know that calls at 4 in the morning were never nothing, and the habit of answering them cleanly without the fog of confusion or resentment was one of the disciplines she had built into herself over 14 years on the bench. The same way you built a muscle through repetition and through the private decision made. So many times, it eventually stopped feeling like a decision that, when the work called you, showed up. She was in a hotel room in Hargrove County, 70 miles from her own courthouse in Lake County, because she had driven down the previous evening for a judicial conference that had ended with a dinner she had stayed at exactly long enough to be polite, and then left because she had learned early in her career that the best thing about judicial conferences was also the most socially inconvenient thing about them, which was that the people who got the most out of them were the ones who went back to their rooms and read. The voice on the phone was Robert Finch, Chief Administrative Liaison for the State Judicial Council, and he had the tight, apologetic tone of a man delivering bad news. He had been practicing for a few minutes before calling, and what he told her was that Judge Harold Wakefield, the assigned presiding judge for Hargrove County's criminal calendar that morning, had been taken to Hargrove Memorial Hospital at 2:45 a.m. with a cardiac event, and that the morning docket 7 hearings, 2 of which were emergency matters that could not be postponed, without real consequences, for real people needed a presiding judge in place by 9 a.m. Serena said yes before he finished the sentence, which surprised him and which she found faintly amusing in the dark of the hotel room, because it seemed to her that saying yes to this was the obvious thing. The only reasonable response when the work needed doing and you were the person positioned to do it, and the fact that it surprised him said something about what people had come to expect from judges when asked to do something inconvenient on short notice. She was already getting out of bed while he gave her the procedural details credentials to be transmitted immediately, assignment order to be faxed to the courthouse chief clerk. Helen Carver would be notified. A robbing room would be prepared. The judge's entrance off the east corridor would be made available. After she hung up, she did not sit down again because sitting down felt like giving the inertia of the early morning a foothold, so she stood at the small desk and read through the emergency docket summary that came through on her phone in the next 12 minutes, while the in-room coffee maker filled the air with the thin, slightly burned smell of hotel coffee which she drank standing up, not because she particularly enjoyed it, but because it was there, and she needed it. And she did not have time to be precious about things that were simply functional. The briefcase she packed from habit rather than ceremony. The yellow legal pad, the reading glasses in the hard case, the assignment order she had printed at the hotel business center at the end of the hall, the emergency docket summary, the 2 pens that she kept clipped to the inside pocket, because she had learned through experience that you always needed more pens than you thought you did. The briefcase itself was the one her mother had given her on the day she was sworn in as a judge, standing in the sun outside the Lake County Courthouse with her mother and her sister's 2 children, and a group of colleagues who had become, over the years, something closer to family than colleagues. Dark brown, leather, solid brass, clasps the kind of bag that was not fashionable in any current sense but was built to last, and which had lasted through 14 years of daily use, through 2 courthouse moves, through a water main break that flooded the lower offices of the Lake County building one February morning, and which had baptized the briefcase in a way that darkened the leather slightly along the bottom seam in a watermark that had never fully faded. She had noticed that morning as she packed that her left palm still carried the faint raised line of a scrape from a slip on wet courthouse steps. The previous November, one of those minor injuries that you forget about immediately and then rediscover periodically as a small texture in the skin, a reminder that even familiar ground could be unreliable in bad weather, and she had run her thumb across it briefly, a habit that had developed in the weeks after the injury when it was still tender, and then she had closed the briefcase and put on her coat and left the hotel at 7:53. The morning was gray and cold, and she walked from the parking garage to the courthouse front walk with the particular focused pace of someone who has somewhere to be, and knows exactly where it is, and the courthouse rose in front of her, stone and glass 4 stories, the seal of Hargrove County carved above the main entrance, the flag moving in the thin January wind at the top of the flagpole, and she had come up the front walk because the assignment confirmation had noted that the judge's entrance was available, but had not specified that it was the only option, and the front entrance was simply the most direct route from where she had parked. She had the assignment order folded in the inner pocket of her coat, and she had not considered not for a moment that she would need it before she reached the front door. He saw her when she reached the 3rd step from the bottom, and something in his chest tightened in the way it always did when he saw something that didn't fit the map he had drawn in his head of who belonged where and when. What he saw was this: a black woman in her late 40s, camel coat, leather briefcase, Dark shoes with a modest heel that were polished in a way that spoke of deliberateness. Hair pulled back in a tight, professional arrangement that left her face open and clear. Walking up the courthouse steps at 8:14 in the morning with the unhurried directness of someone who had somewhere specific to be and had budgeted exactly enough time to get there, no more and no less. What Brandon's brain did with that information in the space of approximately 2 seconds was a process he would never have been able to describe accurately, because it happened below the level of articulation. It was a kind of rapid pattern, matching against a library of associations he had built over 12 years of standing at this door, and what it concluded before a single word had been exchanged was wrong place, wrong profile, not what I'm expecting, check it. He stepped down one stair which put him directly in her path, and he did not greet her. Did not use the neutral professional language of someone performing a security function, just looked at her in that slow, deliberate, top-to-bottom way that was designed to communicate evaluation and found her wanting before the evaluation was even complete. The first time he used the right index finger that morning was to point it over her shoulder toward the back of the building service entrance. Not this door, that's where you want. And his voice had the particular flat authority of someone who expects not to be questioned, which is a very different register from the voice of someone who has genuinely earned that authority and knows the difference between the two. Serena stopped, and she stood very still, and she looked at his finger and then at his face with an expression that was not fear and was not confusion and was not the placating social softness that he was accustomed to receiving from people. He stopped at this door, and she said in a voice that was completely even that she was here for court, that there had been a judicial reassignment that morning and that he could call the clerk's office to confirm. Brandon let out a short, sharp laugh, a dry, humorless sound like something cracking rather than something amused, and he shook his head slowly in the manner of a man who has heard this kind of story before and found it tedious. And then he did the thing that would define the next several hours of his life and the rest of his career and the end of it, which was that he reached up with his right index finger, not pointing now, just displaying badge number 3847 on his chest, tapping it once with 2 fingers in a way that said, "This is what matters here, not anything you have to say," and told her that black women in this building cleaned floors and that they didn't walk through restricted doors acting like they belonged in chambers, and that she should come back when she had a real reason to be here. Serena heard every word of it, and the silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for her to make a decision, not the decision she would eventually make, but an earlier, smaller one, which was that this man was going to give her something today, whether he intended to or not, and that the right thing to do with it was to wait and let it finish building itself. The thing about a man like Brandon Mercer that people who had never stood in front of one tended to underestimate was that the thing that made him most dangerous was not aggression. In the ordinary sense, it was the way her composure worked on him, the way her absolute refusal to become afraid or flustered or tearful in the face of everything he was projecting at her functioned not as a de-escalation, but as the opposite, as an accelerant. Because what he needed in those exchanges, what he had always gotten in those exchanges, was the visible confirmation that he had established the hierarchy, and without it, he had no way to stop the momentum of his own certainty, which kept building, because it had nowhere to go. So when she didn't step back, didn't apologize, didn't soften her voice into the particular register of someone trying to get out of a situation without further trouble, he moved closer, cutting the distance between them in half, bringing with him the smell of the cold morning air and the gas station. Iced coffee and the faint chemical sharpness of the courthouse-issued cleaning spray that he had walked through near the east checkpoint that morning, and he let his physical presence do what his words hadn't managed to do yet, which was to make the space feel smaller, feel occupied, feel like something she should want to leave. She didn't move. He leaned in, bringing his face close enough that she would have been able to see the small scar at the corner of his jaw from an old injury, and he dropped his voice into the register he reserved for moments when he wanted something to feel personal rather than professional. And he said, using the word that courthouse staff who had complained about him before had described in their written statements as the thing that made the interaction feel like something beyond a misunderstanding, the word that crossed the line from aggressive into something uglier and more deliberate. He said it quietly, almost carefully, the way people say things they've said before and know the weight of. And then he told her again to leave. Serena's jaw tightened. The only visible physical response she gave to the slur, a brief compression of muscle that lasted perhaps a second and then released, and she looked at him with eyes that had gone very clear and very still. And she said two things in the same flat, controlled tone, that he was making a serious mistake and that she needed his name and badge number. The right index finger came up again, this time pointing directly at the badge number 3847. Tapping it twice with contemptuous pride, and his voice carried a particular mocking certainty when he said, "File all the complaints you want," and his posture shifted into the wide-legged, arms-out stance of someone who has made a calculation about how this ends and is satisfied with the result. Behind him, near the top of the steps, a young woman who worked the intake desk, Cassie Norris, 24 years old and 8 months into her first courthouse job, had been watching the exchange with the particular frozen expression of someone who knows they should say something and cannot quite convince their body to do it. And she opened her mouth twice without sound coming out, and both times the sound of Brandon's voice cut across the space like something physical, making the gap between intention and action just wide enough that she stayed where she was. On the lower steps, a woman in a navy wool coat who had arrived early for her nephew's hearing had also been watching. And she was not frozen, but she was also calculating something. Calculating the cost of stepping in, which was real, against the cost of not stepping in, which was also real in a way that she understood from long experience. And she had not yet fully arrived at her decision when things moved past the point where a decision would matter for what was about to happen next. She said the thing that ended whatever thread of restraint was left in him. She said that he still had not asked who she was, and the quiet certainty in her voice when she said it, the complete absence of fear, the suggestion that she possessed information he did not have, and that the information mattered, hit something in him that was less like ego and more like panic dressed up as ego, the particular panic of a man who has always gotten away with things and suddenly cannot locate the ground beneath him. He grabbed her coat collar. The motion was fast and practiced in the way that things done many times become automatic, and the grip was tight enough that the fabric twisted against her throat and the sudden force snapped her forward off her balance. And he held her there close enough that she could feel his breath, and close enough that anyone watching could not have mistaken it for anything other than what it was. And he said something into her face in the low, vicious register of a man who believes the volume of his cruelty determines whether it counts as cruelty, and what he said was built out of assumptions about what kind of woman she was and what kind of place she belonged in, and what she would and wouldn't be believed about afterward. She said very clearly, very quietly, with the particular diction of someone choosing each word with the precision of a surgeon, "Let go of me." He pulled her sideways instead. The drag down the steps was not long, 4 steps, maybe 5, but each one was the kind of unsteady lurching motion that happens when one person is holding another person off balance and gravity is doing half the work. And her heels caught on the wet stone, and she stumbled and caught herself and stumbled again, and the briefcase swung hard against her leg. And then he shoved her a flat-palmed push that had enough force behind it that she went sideways and down her hip, taking the first impact on the stone. And then her shoulder and her hand went out instinctively to catch herself and came down on the edge of the spilled cleaning basin's concrete base, and the stone simultaneously, and the scrape across her right palm opened immediately, not deep, but immediate, a thin line of red across the heel of her hand that she did not look at right away, because the basin had tipped when she fell into it, and the gray water, the cleaning water, The dirty floor water was spreading across the stone around her and soaking into her coat and her skirt and her blouse and up the side of the leather briefcase. The briefcase had landed 3 feet away, and its brass corner had found the edge of a stone, and there was a new scratch in it now bright against the old patina, and she reached for it before she reached for anything else. From somewhere above and behind her came the sound of a sharp collective intake of breath, not one person but several, the simultaneous response of a small crowd that had been watching a confrontation and had suddenly seen it become something else. And then a woman's voice said, "Oh my God." And then there was silence, the particular silence of people trying to process what they have just seen against their prior expectation of what was going to happen, which had been some kind of resolution, some kind of backing down. Not this. Brandon stood over her with his chest still out and his hands on his hips, and he looked down at her in the dirty water on the stone steps of the Hargrove County Courthouse. And his expression was the expression of a man who has just done exactly what he intended to do, and considers the matter settled. And then he said, "Stay out," and pointed down at the sidewalk with the right index finger, and the gesture, the finger, the downward point. The particular angle of his arm was something that Marcus Webb, the maintenance worker who had been 20 feet away near the side entrance with a set of door keys in his hand, and who had watched every second of the last 4 minutes without moving, would remember with complete precision when he was asked to describe it later under oath. The right palm of Serena's hand was bleeding in a thin, even line across the heel, and the dirty water stung in it, and she pressed it briefly against the damp stone, and then pushed herself upright with a controlled deliberateness that was one of the most difficult things anyone watching had ever seen a person do, because it looked effortless, and it was not. And when she was standing, she reached down and picked up the briefcase and held it at her side, and looked up at Brandon Mercer with an expression that contained neither anger nor tears, nor the collapse he had been expecting. And what it contained instead, Dorothy Haynes, watching from 4 feet away, would describe it later as the face of a woman who has just watched someone hand her exactly what she needed was clarity. Dorothy Haynes had come to the courthouse that morning on her nephew Jerome's behalf, because Jerome was 26 years old and frightened and had a hearing on a possession charge that his public defender said was manageable, but that required a family member present in a supportive capacity, and Dorothy had not hesitated for a single second when Jerome called her, because that was simply what family was for, and she was not the kind of woman who needed to be persuaded toward her obligations. She was 68 years old, and she wore a navy wool coat over a church dress, because she believed that how you presented yourself to a courthouse said something about how seriously you took the institution and what you expected from it. And she had a small gold cross at her throat that had belonged to her mother, and she had been on the lower steps watching the exchange between Brandon Mercer and the woman in the camel coat since almost the beginning, with the particular wary attention of someone who has spent a lifetime developing accurate early warning systems for the kind of ugliness that was currently unfolding 4 steps above her. When Serena was on the ground and the water was spreading across the stone, Dorothy moved before she fully decided to step forward through the small cluster of frozen onlookers, crossed the few feet of wet stone, and crouched slightly to be at eye level and said, "Are you hurt?" in a voice that was soft enough to be private and steady enough to mean it. Serena looked at her, and there was something in that exchange, in the 2 seconds of eye contact between 2 black women on the wet steps of a county courthouse on a January morning, that communicated something that did not require any words to be complete, and said in a voice that was controlled again already, "I'll be all right. Thank you." Dorothy reached into her purse and produced a small packet of tissues and held them out, and Serena accepted them with a nod that was both gratitude and acknowledgement of something larger than the gesture, and she used one to press against the heel of her right hand, where the blood was thin and bright. Marcus Webb was still standing near the side entrance with his keyring in one hand and his county maintenance jacket zipped up against the cold, and he had not moved during the entire incident because he had learned over 17 years of working in buildings like this one that moving at the wrong moment could change what witnesses saw and what they were subsequently willing to say. And he had stayed exactly where he was watching, with the focused stillness of someone making sure they will remember. And what he was remembering was everything. The grab, the drag, the shove, the water, the finger pointing down at the sidewalk, and the specific, quiet, extraordinary way the woman in the wet coat had gotten back to her feet without any help from anyone. Cassie Norris had come down 2 steps after the shove, her hand half raised toward Brandon, and Brandon had turned on her with a look that said, "One more word from you, and I will make your morning significantly worse than it already is." And the look had worked, because Cassie was 24 and 8 months into her first real job, and she had a mortgage on a small apartment she could not afford to lose, and she had let her hand drop and her mouth close, and she had stood there feeling the particular hollow discomfort of having failed to do the right thing in the moment when it cost something. The crowd that had gathered, a dozen people, perhaps a few more, stood in the loose, uncertain cluster of bystanders who have seen something they did not expect to see, and are now sorting themselves into the categories of people who will say what they saw, and people who will find a way to say less than that. And they were audible in their whispers and their tentative half-conversations. The words, "Who is she, and does anyone know her?" And that was too much. That was too much, filtering through the cold air, in the particular way of people trying to locate a narrative that makes them feel less implicated. Serena stood with the briefcase at her side and the tissue pressed to her palm, and looked at Brandon with the steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is waiting without impatience for the right moment to act on it. "You still haven't asked who I am," she said for the second time. And Brandon looked at her with the expression of a man who has heard something he considers beneath response, and he said, "I don't need to." And the words fell between them, and then just hung there. And Serena gave the smallest, flattest nod, the kind of nod you give when someone has answered a question you weren't actually asking them. She stood on those wet courthouse steps for a long moment after that, alone in the particular way a person can be alone in the middle of a crowd, with the coat growing heavier as the cold water soaked through, and the heel of her right hand beginning to throb in the specific, persistent way of a fresh scrape, and the assignment order still folded neatly in the inner pocket of her coat, 3 inches from where his hand had grabbed her collar, completely undamaged. The thought that crossed her mind was not complicated, and it was not heroic. It was in fact deeply tired in the way that only people who have been through versions of this moment many times can be tired. And what it said was something like, she could end this right now. 3 words. "I am Judge Miles," and the whole geometry of the situation would rearrange itself in the space of a breath. Brandon's posture would change. His voice would change. The crowd would shift and resettle, and she would be ushered inside with apologies layered over apologies, until the apologies themselves became a kind of insult. And the reason she didn't say it? The reason she held those 3 words back and stood there in her wet coat instead, was not strategy, or at least not primarily strategy, because the distinction she was making was a moral one, and she knew it, and it cost her something to make it, which was how she knew it was the right one. If the only protection available on these steps was the protection that came from a title, then every woman who stood on these steps without that title was standing somewhere that had just been confirmed as unsafe, and the title would have been used not to establish a principle, but to establish an exception. And exceptions were not the same thing as justice. And she had spent 14 years on the bench knowing the difference. Dorothy Haynes was still beside her, and Serena looked at her at the navy coat and the gold cross and the sensible shoes of a woman who had gotten up early and dressed carefully because she was coming to a courthouse on behalf of someone she loved, and who had no title, no leverage, no credential to deploy in a situation like this one. And the decision that had been forming in her crystallized into something she would not be able to take back. She would wait and she would let the record build itself, and whatever came next would be thorough enough that it could not be quietly reclassified as a misunderstanding by a man in a back office with a filing cabinet full of resolved complaints. Brandon called for backup on his radio using the language of incident management non-compliant trespasser at main entrance, requesting assistance with removal, and his voice had settled back into the procedural register of someone who has decided the crisis is over and is now handling the paperwork end of it, which told Serena more about the kind of institution she was dealing with than anything he had said directly. From the side entrance, the door opened, and a silver-haired woman in a black cardigan and flat shoes stepped out and stopped completely still. And Serena recognized the expression on her face, because she had seen it before. It was the expression of someone who has just realized that the worst-case scenario they were privately hoping was not happening is in fact happening, and it had been happening for several minutes while they were busy with something else inside. Helen Carver had arrived. Helen had been chief clerk of the Hargrove County Courthouse for 31 years, which meant she had outlasted 4 chief judges, 2 major renovations, 1 flood, 3 corruption scandals at varying levels of the county government, and a rotating cast of deputies and administrators who had arrived with ideas about efficiency and left with a more nuanced understanding of how old institutions actually functioned, which was to say slowly, grudgingly, and with enormous resistance to anything that threatened to make the people inside them visible in ways they had not consented to. She came down the side steps with a speed that belied her age and her flat shoes bypassing Brandon entirely without so much as a glance in his direction. The kind of deliberate social erasure that only becomes possible after decades of professional composure. And she stopped in front of Serena, and her face did the thing that faces do when someone is trying very hard to contain a response and is not fully succeeding. And she said quietly in a voice that was working hard to remain professional, "Judge Miles, I am so sorry." The words landed in the middle of the small crowd like a stone dropped from a height. Brandon Mercer said, "Wait," and then he said it again, differently. And the second time, it didn't sound like a command. It sounded like a man trying to locate a floor that had just disappeared from beneath him. Helen turned to look at him slowly and deliberately with the expression of a woman who has spent 31 years watching men like Brandon Mercer protect themselves with procedure, and has a very accurate understanding of exactly which procedures apply in the present moment and exactly how far they extend. And she said I called her Judge Miles, because that is the title due to the woman you just laid hands on. Nobody on the steps said anything for several seconds. Brandon's face went through a rapid, involuntary sequence. First a kind of blank refusal, the face of someone rejecting incoming information as structurally impossible. Then a flush that climbed from his collar upward. Then a grayness that replaced the flush, and underneath all of it, something that was beginning to resemble very distantly the first cold edge of fear. He looked at her, at the wet coat, the scratched briefcase, the tissue pressed to the heel of her right palm, and his mind tried to make the pieces fit together into a shape that was less catastrophic than the shape they were actually making, and found that it couldn't, because there was no configuration of the available facts that led anywhere good for him. And he had always known, somewhere below the level of his conscious certainty, that the day might eventually come when the buffer ran out. Helen turned back to Serena and said in a lower voice that she needed to come inside, that the robbing room was ready, that they could postpone the docket if Serena needed time. And Serena said no postponement with a quietness and a finality that closed the door on that option completely. She paused just long enough for Helen to notice the bruising that was beginning to form at the base of her neck, visible above the twisted collar of her blouse, where the coat had been grabbed and wrenched a dark smudge of red-purple against her skin, the kind of mark that would deepen over the next few hours. And Helen's face tightened, and she began to say something about medical attention, and Serena shook her head once, and that was the end of that. Serena said, "Document everything. The water, the basin, the steps. Don't clean anything yet." And Helen, I want this heard in the courthouse. Today. Public record, not internal. Helen held her gaze for a moment, and then she nodded. And the nod was not just compliance. It was the agreement of a woman who had been waiting a long time for someone with enough standing to say the thing she had been watching happen for years. Brandon stood at the top of the steps and watched Serena Miles walk into the courthouse that he thought he had been guarding, and for the first time in 12 years of standing at that door, he understood that he was on the wrong side of something that had already started moving, and there was nothing he could do to get ahead of it. Walt Draper's office was on the second floor of the courthouse administrative wing, separated from the noise and traffic of the building's public spaces by a long carpeted hallway and a heavy door that he kept mostly closed, which was less about sound insulation than about the particular psychological comfort of a man who had spent a career in the business of containing things and who found it easier to contain them when there was a physical barrier between himself and whatever needed containing. He was 58 years old, with the kind of soft, settled weight that accumulates in men who have spent decades behind desks and who have made peace with that fact. And he wore a pressed shirt and a loosened tie as his daily uniform in a way that said, I used to care about this, and I still care enough to try, but not enough to fully succeed. And his desk was organized with a precision that had nothing to do with efficiency and everything to do with control, because Walt Draper's primary professional skill was not administration in any meaningful sense, but rather the management of appearances, which he had practiced for so long that he had come to believe they were the same thing. Brandon knocked once and came in without waiting, which was something he had always done and which Walt had always allowed, because allowing it was part of the arrangement between them. Brandon was Walt's ground floor certainty, the man who kept the surface of the institution quiet, and Walt was Brandon's institutional roof, the man who made sure the complaints didn't accumulate into anything load-bearing, and they had been operating in this mutually beneficial arrangement for long enough that it had the comfortable, unexamined quality of a long habit neither of them had any particular reason to question. Brandon told the story standing up because he did not feel the need to sit down, and he told it in the framing he had already chosen. A woman, no credentials presented. No authorization confirmed. Attempting to access a restricted entry point, non-compliant with verbal direction. Physical removal necessary per protocol incident report, filed, situation resolved. Walt listened with the expression he always wore when Brandon reported an incident, which was the expression of a man already mentally constructing the administrative response while the facts were still arriving. And when Brandon finished, Walt asked the one question that told Brandon something had shifted. Did she tell you who she was? Brandon said. Yes, she had said there was a judicial reassignment, had claimed to be here for court, had asked him to call the clerk's office to confirm, and he had determined based on his assessment that the claim was not credible and the entry attempt was not authorized. Walt said with a careful lack of intonation, and you didn't call the clerk's office. Brandon said no, and the word landed differently than he expected it to, lighter than he intended, like something that had lost mass on the way out. Walt picked up his coffee mug and set it back down without drinking from it, which was a gesture Brandon recognized as meaning that Walt was recalculating, and Walt said, "Write the report clean. Standard language. Use protocol framing throughout. Don't elaborate on the specific language you used with her. And don't talk to anybody, not the other security staff, not the lawyers coming through, not anyone until I've had a chance to manage the response on my end." He said it the way he always said things like this, with the calm professionalism of someone who has handled situations like this many times, and the message underneath the words was the one that had always worked before we've gotten out of worse than this. And we'll get out of this too. Brandon nodded, and when he left the office, Walt closed the door behind him with a soft click that meant, "I'm working on it. Stay out of my way. This is manageable." In the hallway outside, Brandon felt the tension in his shoulders ease somewhat the way it always did after a conversation with Walt that ended with implicit reassurance, and he walked back toward the main security checkpoint with the measured gait of a man who has handed his problem to someone else and trusts the handoff to hold. He didn't let himself think about the look on Helen Carver's face. He stopped at the east checkpoint where his colleague Rick Abrams was finishing the log from the early morning entries, and Rick was 29 and had been at the courthouse for 3 years and admired Brandon in the uncomplicated way that younger people sometimes admired experienced people before they had accumulated enough experience of their own to recalibrate. And when Brandon told him about the incident at the main entrance, framing it in the language of a seasoned professional who had just dealt with a complicated situation and handled it correctly, Rick listened with the attentive respect of a student and asked the kinds of questions that Brandon had been hoping someone would ask. He said had a situation at the main entrance this morning. Woman trying to come through without authorization. Claimed to be here for a judicial reassignment. Made the call to remove her. Rick said she put up a fight. Brandon said stayed calm, which is sometimes worse. The ones who stay calm, they're usually running some kind of angle. I've been doing this 12 years. You learn to read it. Rick nodded, and the nod was the confirmation Brandon had been looking for, the external validation that told him the story he had told himself was a plausible one, that 12 years of experience was a credential that could stand in for judgment in a situation where judgment had actually been absent, and Brandon picked up his coffee and drank from it with the ease of a man who has processed a difficult morning and arrived at the conclusion that he handled it correctly. What was happening inside the courthouse while Brandon stood at the checkpoint and drank his coffee was the following. Serena. Miles was in the robbing room being helped into a black robe by a young assistant with trembling hands. Helen Carver was on the phone with the administrative judge's office. Dorothy Haynes was giving her name and contact information to a clerk who was beginning the witness documentation process. Marcus Webb was writing a detailed account of what he had witnessed in the small composition notebook he kept in his jacket pocket for maintenance notes. Cassie Norris was sitting at her intake desk with her hands flat on the surface in front of her and her mouth pressed in a tight line, working herself toward something, and bailiff Thomas Dumont was standing outside courtroom C with a set of hearing files in one hand and an expression on his face that said he had been told something that was going to require him to be very much himself in the next several hours. The dramatic irony of Brandon's contentment in that moment. The particular obliviousness of a man standing outside a building while the building turned itself toward him was not something Brandon was capable of appreciating, because it required being able to see yourself the way other people saw you, which was a skill Brandon had never had any particular reason to develop. Rick asked, "Did you call inside to verify before the removal?" Brandon said. "That's not how it works when someone's non-compliant at the entry point." Rick said, "Okay," and the okay had just the faintest trace of something uncertain in it, something that Brandon chose not to hear. He tapped the counter twice with his right index finger, a habit, a small self-congratulation, a period at the end of a sentence, and picked up his clipboard to start the shift log. The call from Helen Carver came at 8:41, and Walt answered it with the particular controlled smoothness of a man who is already expecting it to be complicated. And Helen told him in the clipped professional tone of a woman who was holding a great deal of emotion back through very deliberate effort. The full name and title of the woman Brandon had removed from the courthouse steps that morning. Walt typed the name into the courthouse directory system before Helen finished speaking. Judge Serena Miles, Lake County. He hit enter. The results came up immediately, and he sat back in his chair and looked at them with the expression of a man who has just opened a door expecting a closet and found the rest of the building on the other side. 14 years on the bench. Chair of the State Judicial Ethics Committee. 3 formal commendations. A profile in the State Bar Journal 2 years ago about judicial leadership. A photograph that matched without any ambiguity the woman Brandon had described removing from the main entrance 40 minutes ago. Walt put the phone down gently and sat for a moment without moving because he was doing the calculation that he had done many times before in situations that were less serious than this one, running the variables of exposure and response and containment and institutional loyalty and personal liability And what was different this time, what he had never encountered before in 12 years of protecting Brandon from his own decisions, was that the math kept coming out the same way no matter how he arranged the variables, which was to say badly. He called Brandon back into his office, and the second conversation was shorter than the first and had a completely different texture because the reassurance had been replaced by a specific kind of careful urgency that was one step below panic, but wearing a professional mask over it. And he told Brandon, "You do not speak to anyone. You do not approach the building's main areas. You wait in the security office and you say nothing to no one until I have contacted the union and figured out the shape of our response." Brandon heard the word union, and his mouth went dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. He said, "How bad is it?" Walt looked at him for a long moment, at the face of the man he had spent 12 years protecting because it was professionally convenient and because the cost of not protecting him had never, until this moment, become real. And he said, "Bad enough that I need you to stop making it worse." After Brandon left, Walt looked at the incident report that Brandon had filed, reading it carefully the way he always read these documents, not for accuracy, but for exposure. Not for what it said, but for what it could be made to say and what it could be made not to say. And what he found was a document written in the clean procedural language of someone who had been trained to write incident reports that were useful rather than truthful. And it occurred to him with a cold clarity that he had been avoiding for several years that he had been complicit in training Brandon to write exactly this kind of document, and that the training was now part of the record, and that the record was going to be opened this morning whether he wanted it to be or not. He pulled up his email and looked at the timestamp on the message from the Judicial Council that had arrived at 6:12 that morning confirming Judge Miles' emergency assignment and requesting security notification. And he looked at the sent folder where the forwarded version of that message to the security supervisor should have appeared, and which did not appear because he had flagged the original message for follow-up and then gotten pulled into a facilities issue with the courtroom C microphone system at 6:30 and had not come back to it. And the follow-up that had never happened was now sitting in the middle of what was becoming the worst day of his professional life. He closed his laptop and rubbed the sides of his face with both hands slowly in the gesture of a man accepting something he can no longer avoid, and then he opened the laptop again and began composing the message to the courthouse union rep, using the kind of careful language that was designed to sound cooperative while protecting as much as possible, which was the only kind of language Walt Draper had ever really been fluent in and which was about to stop working entirely. The robbing room off the clerk's corridor was small and warm and smelled of dry-cleaned fabric and old wood, and it had the particular quality of a space that had been maintained carefully over many years by people who understood that the physical environment of a courthouse was itself a kind of argument that order in the materials suggested order in the proceedings, that care in the details communicated seriousness about what those details were in service of. Helen had turned on the overhead light and the small lamp on the side table, and both were on when she brought Serena inside. And a young woman named Danny Voss, the assistant clerk, who handled robbing room preparation for visiting judges, was already there with a fresh collar tab and a clean copy of the morning's emergency docket, and an expression that was trying very hard to be professional and was not quite succeeding, because what she had seen from the side entrance 20 minutes ago had left her with a specific kind of shaky alertness that had not fully settled. Serena set her briefcase on the wooden table and opened it, and the legal pad inside was dry except for one damp corner, and her reading glasses had survived intact, and the assignment order in the inner pocket of her coat was uncreased and undamaged, and she confirmed these things with the methodical attention of someone checking equipment before a procedure, not because the objects were more important than what had just happened to her, but because the objects were what she had to work with, and she needed to know what she had. Helen moved to the wardrobe and lifted the black robe from its hanger, a spare kept for visiting judges, pressed and ready, and then she turned towards Serena to help her into it. And when Serena removed her coat and the torn, twisted collar of her blouse became visible, Helen stopped for half a second, and in that half-second, her composure did a very specific kind of work because what she was looking at was the bruising that had formed at the base of Serena's neck. Where Brandon's grip had twisted the fabric against her skin, a patch of darkening red-purple that was going to be significantly more pronounced by evening, and the way Helen's face tightened and then immediately recomposed itself was the expression of a woman absorbing an injury that was not hers and deciding where to put the feeling it produced. She handed Serena the collar tab in silence, and Serena replaced the twisted one with the clean one, and when the new collar tab was in place, it covered the bruise completely, and both women knew that it covered it, and neither of them commented on this because the covering of it was not the same as the erasure of it, and they both understood the difference. Danny held out a clean, damp cloth without being asked, and Serena used it on the heel of her right hand where the scrape from the stone had dried into a thin, rust-colored line. Not deep, not serious in any medical sense, but present and specific. And hers in a way that the morning's events had written directly onto her body, which was a different and more permanent kind of record than anything that had been written in any file. Helen said carefully that she could call the administrative judge and request a postponement of the docket, and Serena said no with the same quiet finality she had used on the steps. And then she said the thing that she had been formulating since she was still sitting on the wet stone. If I delay the docket, Brandon Mercer gets to turn what he did to me into disruption for everyone else in this building today. I'm not giving him that. Danny looked up from the fresh docket copy she was straightening and said in a voice that was barely above a whisper that she had been at the side entrance when it happened, that she had seen everything and that she would say so if it would help. Serena looked at her, this young woman with the carefully composed face and the still trembling hands, and said, "It will. Thank you." Helen set the docket copy on the table beside the briefcase and said that 3 people had already offered voluntary witness statements: Dorothy Haynes Marcus Webb from maintenance and one of the intake clerks. And then she paused, and Serena recognized the pause as the shape of something important being weighed, and she waited for it. Helen said, "There have been prior complaints about Officer Mercer. 2 written. Walt Draper's office classified them as resolved." Serena said, "What kind of complaints?" Helen said. "The same kind. The same kind." 2 words that did more work than a paragraph could have done. Serena picked up the briefcase from the table and looked at the new scratch on the brass corner, bright and raw against the old patina, and set it back down gently with the careful attention of someone placing something precious in the right position. And then she put on the robe and stood with it straight on her shoulders, and in the mirror beside the wardrobe cabinet, a composed, unhurried woman in a black judicial robe looked back at her. And what the robe revealed, what it had always been designed to reveal, was not power in the sense that Brandon Mercer understood power, not domination or hierarchy or the right to make other people move, but authority in the sense of purpose served and obligation honored, and a particular kind of accountability to something larger than oneself. Helen said Walt Draper is in the security office with Officer Mercer right now. He'll try to move this through internal channels. He'll call it an administrative matter. Serena said, "If I weren't a judge, where would this report go?" Helen looked at her for a long, honest moment, and the honest moment was the answer. Because if Helen could have said quickly and clearly it would go to the same place it's going now, then she would have said it quickly and clearly, but she didn't. And they both sat with the implication of her hesitation. Serena said, "I want a formal hearing in this courthouse. This morning, on the record, before Walt Draper has time to manage what the record says." Helen said, "That's within your emergency judicial authority as the presiding judge for today's docket." Serena said, "I know. And then I want the exterior footage preserved before anyone touches it. I want the steps documented with photographs before the water is cleaned up. And I want it on record that I have specifically requested that Officer Mercer not be quietly transferred out of the building before witnesses have been formally signed and logged." Helen wrote each instruction in her small leather notebook with the quick, precise handwriting of someone who has spent 30 years translating judicial direction into institutional action, and when she finished, she looked up and said, "Yes, Your Honor." Danny was still in the room, still straightening papers that had long since been straightened, and Serena looked at her and said, "You said you'd testify." Danny said yes. Serena said, "That decision will be harder to make when it's in front of people. I want you to be sure." Danny said, "I'm sure. I was there. I didn't say anything when I should have, and I'm not going to do that again." The room was quiet for a moment, and then Serena picked up the docket copy and her legal pad and her reading glasses, and she said, "What time is it?" Helen looked at the clock, 8:52. Serena said, "Court begins at 9. Thomas Dumont had been a bailiff at Hargrove County Courthouse for 22 years, which meant he had stood in more rooms than he could count, while more things happened than he was supposed to have opinions about. And he had developed over those 22 years a very precise internal taxonomy for the difference between difficult and wrong, which was a distinction that the institution he worked for preferred to blur whenever possible, because the blurring of it made a great many convenient things possible. He was 57 broad-shouldered in a way that had held its shape better than Brandon's had, with close-cropped silver hair and the particular steadiness of a man who has never needed to perform authority because the authority had always just been present in him, quiet and real. When Helen pulled him aside at 8:48 and told him what had happened on the front steps and what Judge Miles had requested, he listened without any change in his expression, and when she finished, he said, "Walt Draper is going to try to move Mercer out of the building before she takes the bench." Helen said, "Yes." Tom said, "I'll make sure that doesn't happen." He said it the way he said all the things he committed to, which was without emphasis or theatrics, because for Tom, Dumont saying something was the same as doing it, and everyone who had worked with him long enough knew this. He walked the corridor to courtroom C with the same measured stride he always used, and as he went, the information was moving through the building. The way information always moved in courthouses, not through any announcement or official channel, but through the organic circulation of people who had seen or heard something and told one other person who told someone else, whispered over coffee cups and across filing cabinets, and through the specific fluency of institutional gossip, which was not the same as rumor, because it ran on actual information, even when it ran faster than official confirmation. By 8:55, most of the lawyers arriving for the morning docket knew something significant had happened. By 8:58, the gallery benches in courtroom C were filling with people who had come to have hearings and were staying because the atmosphere said something more important was about to occur. Tom took up his position outside the courtroom doors and looked down the corridor toward the administrative wing, and he could see at the far end the shape of Walt Draper coming quickly from the direction of the security office, and he watched Draper see him and slow down and understand, from the simple fact of Tom Dumont standing exactly where he was standing and looking exactly the way he was looking, that the morning was not going to go the way Draper had intended it to go. Draper stopped in the middle of the corridor and looked at Tom, and Tom looked back, and neither of them moved for a moment, and then Draper turned around and went back the way he had come, and the corridor was quiet again. From behind the courtroom doors came the sound of people settling into the benches, the low procedural murmur of a morning that was about to begin. Courtroom C was full, in a way that courtrooms are not usually full for emergency proceedings, which typically attract only the directly involved parties and a handful of spectators who happened to be in the building for other reasons. But this morning the gallery was packed with people who had come through the front doors of the courthouse and encountered on the way, in the sight of the wet stone steps and the overturned basin and the small cordoned area where a courthouse photographer was documenting the scene, and who had been told by the person beside them in the security line what had happened, and who had made the decision to take a seat in courtroom C rather than the waiting area, because they understood instinctively that what was going to happen in that room in the next hour was something they would want to have witnessed. Brandon Mercer sat in the front row beside Walt Draper and beside Gerald Farr. the union attorney who had arrived at 8:50 with a leather briefcase that was newer and more expensive than anything else about him, and who had the particular practiced confidence of someone who has been paid to manage situations like this one many times and knows how the machinery of institutional protection works and is experienced in operating it. The three of them together gave off the collective atmosphere of men who are trying to look less worried than they are, which is a specific kind of energy that trained observers, the kind who spend their professional lives reading rooms, notice immediately. Dorothy Haynes was in the second row on the right side, her navy coat on her lap, now her hands folded, her face composed with the patience of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time and is prepared to wait as long as it takes for it to arrive properly. Marcus Webb was in the back row on the left, still wearing his maintenance jacket, his key ring now in his jacket pocket instead of his hand, and he sat with the particular stillness of someone who has decided they are going to hold their ground and doesn't need to announce that decision. Cassie Norris was 3 seats down from Dorothy in the second row, and she was holding her courthouse lanyard in both hands and winding it around her fingers and unwinding it again, which was either nerves or determination or both. And the color in her face came and went in a way that suggested the decision she had made in the robbing room was still being tested against the reality of sitting this close to the thing she had decided to do. The side door opened, and Bailiff Tom Dumont's voice rang out clear and unhurried. "All rise." Every person in the room stood. Serena Miles came through the side door in her black robe and walked to the bench with the unhurried particular authority of someone who knows exactly where they are going and does not need to announce their arrival to the space in order to occupy it. When she set the briefcase on the clerk's counter and reached up to adjust the microphone, the robe cuff rose slightly at her wrist, and the dark bruising that wrapped from her neck down toward her collarbone. The mark Brandon's grip had left when he twisted her collar tight caught the courtroom light for one visible moment before the robe sleeve settled and Priya Okafor, standing at the district council table, looked at it with a stillness that was not passivity but intent, and then looked directly at Brandon Mercer with the expression of a woman who has just seen all the evidence she needs. And Brandon Mercer looked at the table in front of him. Serena sat, adjusted the papers in front of her, and looked out over the courtroom with the composed, measuring attention of someone for whom this was simply where they had always been going and who had arrived exactly where they intended to be. Her eyes moved across the gallery, across the council tables, across the bench, and when they found Brandon Mercer in the front row, they stopped for 3 seconds, not longer, not shorter, 3 deliberate, unblinking seconds, and then moved on to the clerk, and she said, "Be seated." The room lowered itself into a silence that was very different from ordinary courtroom quiet, because it was attentive in the way of people who understand that the particular thing they are about to witness will not be repeated. Serena opened the proceedings in the precise, unhurried voice she used for all formal openings, the voice that said, "The facts are what matter here, and the facts will be stated clearly and in order." And she read the caption and the assignment documentation and the time and location of the incident into the record, with the same care that a surgeon uses to identify every instrument before an operation begins, because the record was the thing that would outlast everything else in the room, and it needed to be built correctly from the first word. Gerald Farr stood and raised an objection about impartiality at the earliest possible moment, which was what he had been paid to do. And Serena addressed it briefly and completely. These proceedings were limited to emergency record preservation, immediate findings, and formal referral. All questions of full adjudication would proceed through appropriate channels without her involvement. Every objection he wished to raise would be preserved in the record for those proceedings. And the objection regarding impartiality was itself going into the record, which meant it would receive proper consideration at the appropriate time, which was not now. Farr sat down, and the efficiency with which he was sat down communicated something to everyone in the room about what the next hour was going to look like. Priya Okafor stood and confirmed the district's presence for emergency institutional review, and her voice had the particular focused quiet of someone who has prepared thoroughly and does not need volume, because the preparation is already doing the work. Serena looked at Brandon Officer Mercer stand. He stood slowly, and the slowness was not insolence. It was the physical expression of reluctance in a body that had not yet accepted what the morning had become. She asked each question once and received each answer once, and the answers were on the record before any objection could be usefully framed, because the questions were factual and the facts were not in dispute. "Did you make physical contact with me this morning at the main courthouse entrance?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Did you seize me by the collar?" "Yes." "Did you drag me down the courthouse steps?" "Yes." "Did you push me into a cleaning basin?" He said, "I pushed you away from the entrance." She said, "That is not what I asked." A pause, and then, "Yes." "Prior to that contact, did you ask for my identification?" "No." "Did you contact court administration to verify my stated purpose?" "No." "Did you ask who I was?" "No." Each yes fell into the courtroom with the weight of a door closing. One door, then another, then another. Brandon's face did the slow, involuntary work of a man watching himself be cornered by his own words, the redness returning, the jaw tightening, and underneath both of those things, visible to anyone looking carefully, the hollow expression of someone watching the structure he had built his certainty on dismantle itself one confirmed fact at a time. Gerald Farr rose twice to object and was twice efficiently overruled, and after the second overruling he stayed in his seat with the expression of a man recalibrating his strategy from prevent the damage to limit the damage. "You may sit, Officer Mercer," Serena said. And he sat down, and the sitting down looked like something leaving him rather than something he chose to do. Dorothy Haynes walked to the witness stand with her purse strap over one wrist, and her back straight and her face carrying the composed dignity of a woman who has been asked to witness many things in her life and has learned that the way you witness something is part of the testimony itself. Priya Okafor approached the podium, and her first question was simply, "Please tell the court in your own words what you saw this morning on the courthouse steps." Dorothy said, "I arrived at the courthouse at 8 o'clock for my nephew's hearing. I was on the lower steps when I first noticed the woman in the camel coat, the woman I now know as Judge Miles, coming up the front walk. She was walking like a person who had somewhere to be and knew where it was. Before she could reach the door, Officer Mercer stepped in front of her, and his voice went loud right away. Not asking, not explaining, just telling her she didn't belong at that entrance. She described what followed with the unhurried precision of a woman who had committed every detail to memory at the time it was happening, because she had recognized immediately that she was watching something that would need to be remembered. The slur delivered quietly enough to be personal. Serena's repeated requests to call administration, the grab, the drag, the push, the water and the briefcase, and Serena's hand going down on the stone. When Priya asked whether Serena had struck Brandon or threatened him at any point, Dorothy said she stayed calmer than most people could have. That was what stood out to me more than anything else. She asked him to verify who she was. She told him he was making a mistake, and he kept deciding every single time that he already knew what she was. Gerald Farr rose for cross and approached Dorothy with a careful smile, and began by noting that she had been on the lower steps rather than directly beside the incident. Dorothy looked at him with the steady regard of a woman who has encountered men using technical precision to evade moral clarity many times before. "I was close enough," she said. He asked whether her history of growing up in the South in the 1960s might give her a particular sensitivity to perceived discrimination that could affect her interpretation. Dorothy looked at him for a moment before answering a moment that was itself an answer, and said, "What I'm sensitive to is meanness dressed up as authority. I know what it looks like. I've been looking at it for 68 years. He tried once more, asking whether she was emotional during the incident. She said I was awake. That's all I was. Farr had no usable response to that, and the gallery felt it, and when he said no further questions, the phrase carried the particular deflation of retreat. Dorothy stepped down without looking at Brandon Mercer, and the not looking was understood by everyone in the room as a precise and intentional form of contempt that was more devastating than any direct confrontation could have been. Marcus Webb took the witness stand with his maintenance keys in his pocket and his jacket still zipped, and he looked like a man who had arrived to do a job and intended to do it to the same standard he applied to everything else. When Priya asked him to describe what he had witnessed, he said, "I came through the side door at roughly 8:10, with a set of keys to check the door alarm near the lobby. I stopped when I saw the confrontation at the main steps. I stayed where I was and watched the whole thing without moving." He described what he saw in the language of a man who fixes things for a living. Specific, mechanical, no ornamentation, with the particular authority of someone who is describing not what he felt about events, but what the events consisted of. The grab, the angle of the drag, the force of the push, the exact position of the cleaning basin. The fact that Serena had been given no opportunity to reach for identification before the physical contact began. Priya asked, "Before you saw Officer Mercer use physical force, did you observe anything that could be described as threatening behavior on Judge Miles's part?" Marcus said. "No." She stood still. She spoke. She asked him to call inside. That was it. Priya asked, "In your 17 years in this building, have you ever seen security staff physically remove someone from the front steps?" Marcus said, "I've seen people turned away. I've seen people asked to wait. I've seen people escorted to a different entrance. I have never seen someone grabbed and dragged and put on the ground." He then said something that had not been in any question. "I've also seen Officer Mercer before. I've seen how he stands at that door. I know when a man is doing his job, and when a man is doing something that feels like his job but isn't." Farr objected. Serena said, "The witness may testify to his observations and interpretations based on direct experience." "Continue, Mr. Webb," Marcus said. He didn't stop her because he thought she was a security risk. He stopped her because she didn't look to him like she belonged there, and she didn't shrink when he told her she didn't. That was what he couldn't handle. Farr's cross was thorough and ultimately unsuccessful because Marcus Webb had the quality of certain witnesses that makes cross-examination difficult, which was that he only said what he knew and knew exactly what he said, and the precision of his account left no gap in which doubt could be usefully inserted. When Farr suggested that Marcus's interpretation of Brandon's motives was subjective, Marcus said, "I fix broken things for a living. I know when something's stuck because it's broken, and I know when somebody's forcing it because they're angry. This morning wasn't confusion. It was a decision." He stepped down and returned to his seat in the back row without looking at anyone in particular, and the solidity of his testimony sat in the room like something heavy that had been placed carefully and would not be moved. Cassie Norris was 24 years old, and she had been in her courthouse job for 8 months, and when she took the witness stand, she looked like someone walking through a door. They have been gathering courage to open for a long time and have finally decided to open. She confirmed everything Dorothy and Marcus had said, and she did it with the specific exactness of someone who has been rehearsing not the words, but the commitment to say them truthfully. And when Priya asked her whether she had heard Brandon use racial language before the physical contact, Cassie said yes and described what he had said about black women and what they were for in a courthouse, and her face as she said it carried the shame of having heard it while it was being said and not having stopped it. Priya asked, "Did you attempt to intervene?" Cassie said, "I started to. I had my hand up. He turned on me and I backed down." And then she said, "I've been telling myself all morning that I didn't do anything wrong. But I did. I did nothing. And nothing is a choice." There was a silence after that, A slightly different kind of silence from the ones that had preceded it, because it was the silence of people sitting with something that was also true of many of them. Priya waited a moment and then said, "Why are you testifying today?" Cassie looked at her hands and then looked up and said, "Because if I stay quiet now, I was part of it. And I'm already part of it enough." Farr's Cross was the shortest of the three because there was almost nothing useful to attack in what Cassie had said, and when he tried to suggest that her guilt about not intervening might have colored her recollection, she said, "I feel guilty because it happened exactly the way I said it happened." He sat down. Priya requested the exterior footage from the courthouse security system, and Walt Draper, who was seated beside Gerald Farr and who had been growing progressively smaller in his chair over the course of the morning, started to say that the full feed was still being processed. Helen Carver, from her seat in the second row, said, "The north pillar angle has been available since 8:47. I received confirmation of preservation at 8:52. The room noticed that she was looking at Walt Draper when she said it, and the room understood what the look meant, and Walt Draper understood it too, and he did not speak again. The courtroom monitor came on, and the footage was the precise, unambiguous visual record of everything the witnesses had described in words: Serena coming up the front walk with her briefcase, Brandon stepping into her path, the confrontation, the grab, the drag, the push, the water, and then Brandon standing over her with his right index finger pointing down at the sidewalk in the gesture that had been described by every witness and which on the screen in the clear January light looked exactly like what it was a man using the gesture of authority over someone he had just put on the ground. The footage had no audio, but it did not need any. The gallery watched without sound. The collar grab, unmistakable. The drag down the steps. The shove, the basin tipping gray water spreading across stone, and then the moment that said everything. Brandon standing over Serena, chest out, right index finger pointing downward. The same gesture he had used 100 times to tell people where to go. And Serena getting up, alone, without help, reaching for the briefcase before reaching for anything else. When the screen went dark, nobody spoke for 5 full seconds. 5 seconds of silence in a packed courtroom is a long time. It is the sound of people absorbing something they cannot unsee and do not want to forget. Priya said quietly, "Your Honor, the district rests." Brandon was looking at the blank screen. Not with remorse, not yet, but with the specific expression of a man who has just been forced to watch himself the way other people have always seen him, and found the distance between those two things much larger than he had ever imagined. Serena said, "Mr. Draper, stand." He stood with the expression of a man who had been dreading this moment and had run out of ways to delay it. Priya approached with her legal pad and the careful precision of someone who had organized her questions in the order most likely to produce a complete picture. "As Deputy Court Administrator, you received notification of Judge Miles' emergency assignment this morning, correct?" Walt said, "I received a notification." "Yes. At what time?" 6:12 a.m. "And as part of that notification, were you asked to ensure that courthouse security staff were informed?" Walt paused, and the pause was its own answer before he provided the verbal one. "There was a technical issue with the courtroom audio system that required my attention at approximately 6:30 and I." Priya said, "Mr. Draper, did you forward the notification to the security supervisor?" Walt looked at the table. No. So the building knew Judge Miles was coming. Officer Mercer did not. "Because you received the notification and did not pass it on." Farr objection. Argumentative. Serena overruled. The witness will answer. Walt said, "It was an oversight." Priya moved on. "In your capacity as Deputy Court Administrator, are you the supervising officer responsible for maintaining the complaint file for courthouse security staff?" Walt said yes. "How many written complaints have been filed against Officer Mercer in the past 18 months?" Walt said 2 written complaints, several verbal concerns. "And those written complaints were classified by your office as resolved." On what basis? Walt opened his mouth and closed it and said, "Internal review found them to be isolated incidents without sufficient pattern to warrant disciplinary action." "Isolated incidents," Priya said. "And who conducted those internal reviews?" Walt said with the voice of a man hearing himself speak for the last time in a particular way. "My office. The same office responsible for supervising the officer who was the subject of the complaints." Farr was up. Objection. Serena overruled. Priya said, "Mr. Draper, the prior complaints, what was the demographic pattern of the individuals who filed them?" Walt was very still for a moment, and the stillness told the room as much as any answer would, and then he said, "They were filed by minority visitors or employees." The room absorbed this without sound. Brandon looked at Walt, and it was the first time he had looked at him directly since they had all come into the room together, and what was in his expression was not anger exactly, but something closer to the specific feeling of a man who realizes that the person he believed was holding a rope on his behalf has been, in fact, holding only their own end. Serena said, "The record will reflect the administrative notification failure and the prior complaint pattern and the classification of those complaints as resolved by the same office responsible for the officer who is the subject of today's proceedings." She looked at Walt steadily. "You may sit, Mr. Draper." He sat down with the particular heaviness of a man who has run out of road, not a villain falling, but something sadder. A man who spent 3 decades picking the comfortable option every single time, and who was now sitting inside the accumulated weight of all of them. Serena read the findings into the record in the same even voice she had used throughout the proceeding, and the evenness of it was not detachment. It was the particular kind of controlled authority that comes from someone who has decided that the facts are enough, and that adding anything emotional to them would only reduce their power, because facts stated plainly without embellishment and without apology carry a weight that no performance can match. The clerk's keyboard moved with a steady, rapid rhythm as each finding was stated and recorded. First, that Officer Brandon Mercer had engaged in physical misconduct toward the temporary presiding judge at the main courthouse entrance on the morning of the current date, including seizure by the collar, forced removal by dragging, and intentional pushing into a cleaning basin. Second, that he had failed at any point during the interaction to make a lawful attempt to verify the identity or assignment of the person he detained, despite repeated verbal requests to do so. Third, that his conduct had included language that was racially discriminatory in character, as confirmed by witness testimony and the officer's own admission. Fourth, that the written incident report filed by Officer Mercer following the event materially omitted each of the above uses of force constituting falsification by omission. Fifth, that administrative notification failure on the part of Deputy Court Administrator Walter Draper had contributed to the conditions that made the incident possible. Sixth, that the above findings warranted immediate suspension, formal criminal and civil rights referral, and comprehensive preservation of all related records. Gerald Farr stood and said that his client acknowledged errors in judgment, but that the administrative communication failure represented a substantial contributing factor. Serena said, "It will be noted." And then, the administrative failure did not put racial language in Officer Mercer's mouth. It did not drag me down those steps. It did not write a false report after the fact. "Sit down, counselor." Farr sat. Serena said, "Officer Mercer, stand." He stood. The slowness of it said everything. She looked at him directly, and what she said was short, and it was the last thing she said to him in that room. "You made a decision about who belonged in this courthouse before you asked a single question. Today this courthouse makes its decision about you." That was all. The silence that followed was the most powerful thing in the room. Then your badge and your access card. Brandon reached down with hands that were not fully steady. He unclipped badge number 3847 from his belt, the same badge he had tapped twice on the steps that morning with contemptuous pride. The badge that was a license, a language, a weapon, and he set it on the council table. He removed the plastic access card from his jacket pocket and placed it beside the badge. 2 small sounds, 2 ordinary objects. The right index finger had nowhere left to point. She did not look at Brandon when she spoke. She looked at the courtroom, at Dorothy in the second row, at Marcus in the back, at Cassie with her lanyard still in her hands, at the dozen people who had come in for other reasons and stayed for this. Her voice was quiet. It did not need to be loud. A courthouse does not belong to the men who guard its doors. It belongs to the law, and the law belongs to every person who walks through those doors. She paused. What happened on those steps this morning matters not because of who I am. It matters because no person, not one, should be treated as less than human while asking to be heard. If the only thing that makes this morning unacceptable is that I turned out to be a judge, then we have learned nothing. That was where she stopped. Not another word. Not another sentence. She let the silence do the rest because the silence in that room with those people in it was already saying more than any further language could reach. Dorothy Haynes closed her eyes briefly. Just briefly. When she opened them, her face was composed and bright and had the expression of a woman who has been waiting a very long time to hear something said plainly in a room where it was supposed to matter. Cassie Norris looked down at her hands and her shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in the particular release of a person who has told the truth about something they carried alone for too long. Marcus Webb sat in the back row exactly as he had sat all morning, and the stillness of him was the stillness of a man who needed nothing added to what had already been said. After the gallery cleared, Serena summoned Walt Draper into a small conference room adjacent to the clerk's corridor with Helen Carver and Priya Okafor present as witnesses, and she issued 4 formal orders into the supplemental record. First, all prior complaint files regarding Officer Mercer were to be transmitted directly to the administrative judge's office and the district's Civil Rights Division, bypassing Walt Draper's office entirely. Second, all records from the morning's incident were to be preserved in full and transmitted within 24 hours, without exception. Third, Walt Draper was formally cited for administrative negligence in the failure to forward the judicial assignment notification, and for a pattern of complaint resolution that had shielded a repeatedly complained-about officer from any meaningful accountability. Fourth, no staff member who had served as a witness in these proceedings was to face any form of professional consequence as a result of their testimony, and any such action would be treated as witness intimidation and referred accordingly. Walt received each order in sequence with the face of a man who has finally arrived at the bill for every easy choice he made across 30 years and found the total larger than he had ever calculated it would be. When it was over, he left the room without looking at Helen, and Helen watched him go without speaking, because the paperwork that was now moving through proper channels was sufficient response and she had nothing to add to it. After he was gone, Priya said quietly, 12 years of cover. That's what it took, Helen said. He spent 12 years protecting Mercer. He spent 12 years protecting himself. They were always the same thing. Serena was alone in the judge's chambers at 1247, and the room had the particular quality of a space that has held a great deal of weight and released most of it and is now simply itself the desk, the lamp, the window with its view of bare oak trees patient in the January cold. The morning criminal docket had run until 12:15. 7 cases, 7 rulings. A mother had cried quietly through a plea colloquy. A public defender with tired eyes had thanked the court for a continuance she clearly needed. The work had gone on because the work always went on, and the people who came to that courtroom with their pain and their fear deserved a judge who was present for them, and Serena had been present. The briefcase was on the floor beside the desk. She had wiped it down twice. The leather was largely restored, but the new scratch on the brass corner was still bright. There was a knock, and Dorothy Haynes came through the door carrying a paper bag and 2 paper cups in a cardboard tray, and she looked at Serena with the straightforward practicality of a woman who has decided that the most useful thing she can offer is not sentiment, but food. She said, "You haven't eaten." Serena said, "You didn't have to do this." Dorothy set the bag on the desk and said, "Yes, I did," and the firmness of it closed the matter. She sat in the chair across from the desk with the ease of someone who has been sitting in chairs and waiting out long, difficult days for 68 years, and has no anxiety about the sitting, and she looked at the bruise at the base of Serena's throat, visible now without the robe darkening through the afternoon into the specific purple of something that had been done deliberately and would take weeks to fully fade, and then looked away. Not because the sight of it was difficult, but because staring at someone's injury is a second invasion, and Dorothy Haynes had too much respect for that. She said, "I've been thinking about something since the courtroom, about what you said, that it shouldn't depend on who you are." Serena said, "It shouldn't." Dorothy said, "No." But today it did. And today still counts. Because today you made it mean something, and that meaning is in the record now. And the record is harder to lose than people think. Serena said, "He thought he picked somebody nobody would defend." Dorothy said, "That's right." And instead, he found out that dignity can sit in places he never thought to look for it. The room was quiet for a moment, and through the window the bare oak trees moved very slightly in the January wind, their branches particular and clear against the pale sky. Serena said, "The problem is, all the times he picked somebody who didn't have a title and nobody was in the right room to make it mean something." Dorothy said, "I know." She folded her gloves in her lap. "That's why today has to matter the way it does. Not just for you. For all of them." Serena unwrapped the sandwich and ate part of it, and the silence that followed was the comfortable kind between people who have said enough of the right things and don't need to fill what remains. Dorothy stood to leave, paused at the door, and looked back. "I'm too old to call silence wisdom," she said. "And I'm glad you're not either." After she was gone, Serena sat for a moment with the scratched briefcase beside her and the remains of the sandwich on the desk and the cold coffee she drank anyway, and then she opened the file for the next day's calendar and began to read, because that was what serious people did, and she had always been one of them, and the morning had not changed, that had only confirmed it. 6 months after the morning on the courthouse steps, Hargrove County Circuit Courtroom 4 handed down the following: Officer Brandon Mercer, badge number 3847, was found guilty on 2 federal counts: deprivation of rights under color of law and filing a false official report. Sentenced to 38 months in federal correctional custody. No early release provision. Pension forfeited in full 14 years of contributions gone. The forfeited amount, $61,400, was to be dispersed as follows: half to the Hargrove County Civil Rights Legal Fund established in the wake of the case to provide free legal representation to courthouse visitors who experienced misconduct at entry points, half to Dorothy Haynes, formally acknowledged by the court as a material witness whose testimony was central to the proceeding. Dorothy had said when informed that she did not want the money for herself. She put it in a fund for Jerome's legal fees and used the remainder to pay the first year of tuition for her youngest niece who was studying pre-law. Brandon Mercer surrendered to federal custody on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week he had always favored for standing at the courthouse door, watching the sidewalk below with the particular alertness of a man who was looking for something to correct. He wore civilian clothes that did not fit him the way his uniform had. He did not look at anyone as he walked into the processing center. The right index finger was just a finger now. It had nowhere left to point and nothing left to say. Walt Draper did not go to federal prison. What happened to him was quieter and in some ways worse. He was formally stripped of his deputy administrator title the week after the hearing, citing a documented pattern of complaint suppression and administrative negligence. He was offered a clerical position in the county records archive, a windowless room on the basement level of the administration building, filing documents that other people had written for a fraction of his former salary. He accepted it because his pension was conditional on completing his years of service, and walking away meant losing that too. He sat in that basement room for the remaining 14 months until his retirement eligibility date, and in that time, the courthouse above him was quietly, methodically cleaned. Every security complaint from the previous 5 years was reopened and reviewed. 3 additional incidents were flagged. 2 required further action. The machinery that had protected Brandon Mercer, the informal understandings, the buried paperwork, the management responses that resolved everything by resolving nothing, was disassembled piece by piece. Not with drama, but with the slow, grinding diligence of institutional correction at its most unglamorous and most necessary. Walt Draper retired on a gray Tuesday morning 14 months later, and no one from the courthouse attended his retirement luncheon. He had sent himself the invitation. 3 months after the hearing, Cassie Norris was working the intake desk on a Wednesday when a woman in a dark coat came up the front steps with a briefcase and an armful of folders, moving with the focused directness of someone who had been here many times and knew exactly where they were going. Cassie watched her come through the main entrance without being stopped, without being questioned, without anyone stepping into her path and asking her to account for herself before she had taken 3 steps inside the building. The woman signed in at the intake desk, said good morning, and went down the hall toward the public defender's offices. Cassie watched her go and felt something she could not immediately name, and then she named it. It was relief, the specific, uncomplicated relief of a morning going the way mornings were supposed to go, of a door being just a door, of a person being allowed to simply arrive. She looked back at her desk. On the corner of it, tucked under the edge of her monitor, was a small laminated card she had printed herself a week after the hearing and kept there as a reminder of a decision she had made about who she intended to be in the rooms where she worked. It said, "Say something, before it gets worse, every time." She hadn't needed to use it yet that morning. She hoped she wouldn't need to, but it was there if she did. Lake County Courthouse was smaller and older than Hargrove's, and Serena's chambers on the 2nd floor looked out over a parking lot and a stand of maples that were showing the first tentative green of early spring. Small leaves barely there, the kind of new growth that looked uncertain about its own existence, until a few warm days convinced it to stay. The briefcase was under her desk, where it always went in the specific spot it had occupied for 14 years, and the brass corner bore 2 scratches. Now the older one from the November slip, which had faded into the general character of the leather over the months, and the newer one from the Hargrove courthouse stone, which was still more distinct, still legible if you knew where to look. She had not had it repaired. On her desk beside the morning's calendar was a single sheet of paper that had arrived by state mail the previous week, official letterhead brief signed by the administrative judge of the 5th District, the entry verification protocol piloted at Hargrove County in the weeks following her emergency proceeding had been adopted. Statewide, effective the 1st of the month, applicable to all courthouse security personnel across the district's 42 county buildings. Her name was not on the paper. The name on the paper was the name of the law, which was as it should be. There was a knock. Danny Voss, who had joined the Lake County Clerk's office 8 weeks ago, and had brought with her the particular focused attention of someone who understands exactly why the work matters, because she had watched from 20 feet away what happened when the work failed. She set the morning calendar and a cup of black coffee on the desk with the quiet precision that had already become her signature. Serena said, "Thank you." Danny said, "Of course, Your Honor," and left, closing the door with the same gentle click that all the doors in this building had. Serena looked at the briefcase. She thought about the scratch. She thought about the step and the water and the cold stone, and a woman she had never met before that morning, who had pressed a packet of tissues into her bleeding hand and stayed beside her without being asked to stay. She thought about Marcus Webb, standing at the side entrance with his keys, deciding to remember everything. She thought about Cassie Norris saying, "I didn't say anything when I should have, and I'm not going to do that again." Then she opened the first file, adjusted her reading glasses, and got to work. Because serious people always showed up, the morning had not changed that. It had only confirmed it. And the work, as it always had, was waiting. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something when Dorothy stepped forward, when Marcus refused to look away, when a woman in a wet coat chose to let the truth build itself, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like this one exist because people like you keep showing up for them. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next.